All right, so "Let It Bleed" by the Stones, and we've talked about the Stones a lot, and when I go back to the well with the band, I don't really like to go back to like real fine details, but I want to kind of go into what the context of this album was. And it is impossible to talk about "Let It Bleed" without talking about the American tour that the Stones did before this, for a number of reasons. And boy, it's going to be hard to narrow it down, but I'm going to do the best I can to bullet point it. So in terms of chronology, this album falls right before Sticky Fingers, which would come in the 70s, which starts a run of, kind of considered to be the Stones' best run. And "Let It Bleed's" number 2 in that run, Sticky Fingers is 3, and directly preceding it at number 1 on that run is Beggar's Banquet, which you covered before. For those that want to extend out, the 4th album of that run is Exile on Main Street. So that's like sort of the big 4 in terms of a run for the Rolling Stones, where they're sort of at their peak artistically and critically. There's a lot of other great albums, but that's kind of where they're considered. I personally think Aftermath is in that category, but of course there were a couple albums released in between Aftermath and Beggar's Banquet that don't allow it to be as neat as a run right there. But I would say I would put Aftermath in that run because, as we talked about when I covered that, I apparently like that album much more than Josh and Matt did, but I put it in that run. For the Stones. This is the 8th British Rolling Stones release and the 10th American release, because they tended to bundle together more of their singles into albums for the American audience. The tour that I referenced, boy, okay, where do we go on this one? The tour was the first one since 1966 when the Stones come. And you want to talk about taking some time off and then coming back. So
yeah, right.
The Stones are gone in 66, and then they can't come to America for like 3 years, right? Because of drug issues and visa issues. And during that time, the Stones go from like teeny boppers playing in front of teenagers, right, into the sleazy Rolling Stones that, you kind of come to know in the late 60s and the 70s. So you want to talk about changing the image. The Stones went all the way in and leaned on that. So anyway, they decided to do a U.S. tour, and a lot of the U.S. tour was as much so that they could go see, and this would continue in the Sticky Fingers tour too. They like to schedule their tour around going to see primarily African-American artists that they loved, especially in the South and places like that. So this album in general, "Let It Bleed," is considered to be a love letter to like all things African-American music, not just the blues that we know the Stones love or the R&B we know the Stones love, but also gospel, sort of that blues country sound that comes out of it. But basically just all of the African-American music that the Stones were deeply influenced by. All the British invasion acts were to a degree, but the Stones certainly by far the most, right, across all genres. So they do a tour in 1969, and when they're playing this tour, they're playing, instead of to screaming teenage girls, now they're playing to like more adult music appreciation folks, right? So their audience has changed quite a bit. They're now considered a serious band playing serious music with serious adult themes, right? And some of that is because of what happened in the world of music between 1966 and 1969. So you'll love this one, guys. They are getting ready for the tour. And one thing I should mention, by the way, too, is that this tour, the pre-Let It Bleed tour, is considered to be the first concert tour that existed like in the way that we think of concert tours now. Does that make sense, guys? In the sense that they went to dates, they had amplification systems and lighting, they went from city to city and, kind of lived the rock star lifestyle. Even the way that they financed the tour. They basically the business model was totally different, and they got a part of the gross, right? And then they got a 50% advance, which became pretty steady for how bands toured 70s, 80s, 90s, even today to some degree. But back then, it was more just independent shows you would book, right? And, your record label kind of did it. This was more, they just hired a manager to secure box office receipts, and they had ancillary rights. They sold merchandise and posters and t-shirts at stands like you would imagine concerts now, right? And so this was a incredibly revolutionary tour, and that there really hadn't been one like it. It also had opening acts, most notably Ike and Tina Turner, B.B. King and Terry Reid. And then sometimes B.B. King was out, so Chuck Berry would fill in. So it had like superstar openers, right, that were influences on the band, which becomes something that you see in touring acts down the road. It's either like an up-and-coming band, right, or a label mate, or an influence. The tour also sold over $1 million in tickets in 1969, which was a massive amount of tickets for about 30 shows. When they're getting ready for this show, and here's where I'll go back to the thing that I think you guys will enjoy. They practiced in Stephen Stills' home. So in case you're wondering, they did practice in a sex mansion for this tour.
That sounds about right.
So perfect. The tour began at Colorado State University and was supposed to end with an add-on show in Florida. But folks, unfortunately, they decided to play one more show at the end of that tour. And let's see how well you guys know your music history. Well, what was the last show the Stones played on this tour?
That would be Altamont.
Altamont.
You got it, Altamont. And I don't even know how to bullet point this, but let's just say Altamont did not go well. Quick bullet point. That's just Altamont was supposed to be the West Coast Woodstock. It was 4 months after Woodstock itself. It featured 4 deaths, including an LSD-induced drowning, 2 hit-and-run fatalities, and most notably a stabbing of a gentleman who pulled a gun and was attempting to rush the stage. Yep. What is often remembered about this, for a number of reasons, because it was basically the Rolling Stones released a concert album called Get Your Ya-Ya's Out a year after this, which documented a lot of the shows. But also there was a documentary made the year afterwards as well called Gimme Shelter.
Yeah. Yep. I did watch that before tonight.
Yep. Which is one of the most famous concert films ever, and probably I would say probably the first what we think of as a concert film, because that tour was one of the first of what we think of as a real tour, right? But Altamont featured Santana, Jefferson Airplane, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, the Stones, and the Flying Burrito Brothers. The Grateful Dead were supposed to play, but backed out basically when they kind of read the tea leaves that it was getting violent, because it did. The Hells Angels were there. Like, you can do a whole episode on just what went wrong with this, not to mention the fact that LA was a scary place in 1969 and was in 1967 and 1968 too. But this was sort of if the Beatles get credit for starting the Summer of Love, this has a pretty good stake as ending the Summer of Love with, violence and sort of like the bloom was off the rose of flower children. So if you want a neat narrative, there you go. That's it. But I'm sort of talking about the Hells Angels were hired to do security on this at the recommendation of the Grateful Dead, which is hilarious in its own right. So the stage was set up so it was low lying, but it was also on a hill. So they were worried about logistical elements of it. It's very hard to describe what was going on. They also knew pretty much everybody was going to be just stoned out of their mind. And we're talking stoned. We're talking methamphetamines, LSD. We're not talking like pot, right? We're talking like crazy, make you violent type drugs, right?
People getting naked, freaking out. I saw all that.
Pulling guns and trying to shoot the Rolling Stones, stuff like that. And the Hells Angels were basically hired for, the story is $500 in beer to watch the stage. And they were supposed to just make sure that no one was getting murdered or raped at the most basic sense, right? And also to protect the Stones. Things get out of hand. There's basically a murder that's caught on camera that ended up being, and probably fairly, despite the Hells Angels' poor conduct in other areas, but it is clearly, you can see, unfortunately, a gentleman who is very hopped up on methamphetamines trying to rush the stage, and he actually pulls a handgun out. Yeah. And so a member of the Hells Angels actually stabs him, and it was eventually ruled to be a justifiable homicide. There's a lot of other dynamics to it. It was a very young man. I think he was 18 years old, African-American gentleman. Yeah. Yep. And so there were sort of racial dynamics and stuff as well. But anyway, a total mess. And the Stones actually ended up playing their entire show, stopping multiple times because they were afraid of what would happen if they didn't finish, right? But they, you can see, it's very funny, you can see Mick Jagger's definitely freaked out, as with other members of the band. The only guy who looks remotely unperturbed is Keith Richards, which is on brand, right? And even later he said, things kind of got out of hand, but it was okay. Whereas, Mick Jagger is basically in the aftermath of this, he gets married and decides to, settle that, all that stuff. Well, at least for that time period, right? So that's a very long story short. I'm not going to kind of go into anything else in terms of the nitty-gritty of the band, because I have to go on to one other massive thing that happened, and that is that Brian Jones died in between Beggar's Banquet and this album. And so this album is the first one with Mick Taylor, who replaced Brian Jones on this album. Okay, do you guys remember Mick Taylor, where he came from?
John Mayall and Blues Breakers?
Yep, he comes from John Mayall and the Blues Breakers, but he also was floating around the Pretty Things for a while as well. Okay. So, yep. So, Brian
but he
Jones,
wasn't the one. There was another guy that started the
Dick
Stones.
Taylor. Dick Taylor, yes.
Yeah, because I was thinking the Pretty Things, but then I was like, but that guy left early, so wow.
Yep.
All right.
Mick and Dick. Yep, Mick and Dick Taylor. So they both were involved with the Stones at different points and the Pretty Things at different points.
Things. Wow.
Yep. So yeah, unfortunately, Brian Jones passes away a month after he's kicked out of the band. He's kicked out of the band largely because in Beggar's Banquet, he barely was holding on, and then in Let It Bleed, it kind of all fell apart, which is apropos for the name of this album. He's actually on 2 tracks. He plays the auto harp on You Got the Silver and percussion on Midnight Rambler. Mick Taylor actually only plays on 2 tracks on this album as well, Country Honk and Live With Me. The rest of the stuff was pretty much done by Keith Richards and studio players. So if Sgt. Pepper was a Paul McCartney album, this is even more so a Keith Richards album. This is considered to be the most Keith Richards album of the Stones up until maybe the mid-'80s when the Stones are having the feud between Jagger and Richards, and they're going back and forth and stuff. But if you want to know what a Keith Richards album sounds like, even though Mick Jagger wrote the lyrics, it's this album. He's basically playing multiple he's doing the Paul McCartney thing where he's playing multiple instruments, and he's even re-recording Charlie Watts' drums at one point and different stuff. There's studio musicians who he also brings in as well. This album has all kinds of instrumentation that isn't necessarily always seen with the Stones: mandolin, organ, French horn, saxophone, fiddle, auto harp, and the piano, as played by CTS legend Nicky Hopkins. It also has a boat ton of slide guitar, as played by Keith Richards. Pretty much every song has some elements of slide guitar. As I mentioned before, this was basically a love letter to African-American music at that time and beforehand, and this album hit number 1 in the UK and number 3 in the US and was pretty much well regarded by critics from the jump. So that is a little bit of Let It Bleed. Josh, go ahead, I'm sorry.
I was going to say, I believe it knocked out Sgt. Pepper in the UK charts.
Oh.
Sgt. Pepper was on the charts for 2 years?
69?
Maybe I'm thinking of something else. Maybe another album? Maybe another Beatles album? I don't know. Anyway, sorry.
Okay. Well, yeah, Let It Bleed was released on December 6, 1969, and Sgt. Pepper was 67. So unless the Beatles were on for 2 years up top.
Was the Abbey Road one? I think maybe it was Abbey Road.
Abbey Road was 69
Abbey Road would have
been,
yeah. Let It Be was 70.
Okay. Anyway, so my thoughts on the album, is that what you're saying?
Yep, I do want to add one more thing, too. When the Stones came for that tour, a bunch of people were trying to get them to commit to political causes, including the Black Panthers, who asked them for an endorsement, primarily because the song Brown Sugar made them think that Jagger might be receptive and that Keith Richards might also be receptive because of his love of blues, but they kind of said thanks but no thanks. So the Stones did not become the MC5's spiritual predecessor or antecedent. So go ahead, Josh. I'm sorry to steal your thunder there.
Oh, no. I was going to say this album I haven't heard this album in a long time, and it is amazing. It's such a tight album. It's such a refreshing look at the Stones at their peak. You have Gimme Shelter, which is an absolutely iconic monster rock song that is so dark, and this whole album as a whole, and including that song, kind of foretell the problems of the 60s and bring in, I would say, the close of the 60s in a dark way, saying, how we've always thought about, things were peace and love. This is saying, no, there's a dark side to that, as we've mentioned a couple times. Gimme Shelter specifically is almost an overplayed song at this point. I can't help but thinking of it from Scorsese's many soundtracks he uses in, like Goodfellas and Departed. But trying to listen to it with fresh eyes, it does things so well. You have the backing singer. What's her name, John? Do you have it on hand? Make sure she has credit.
I don't have it on the front. I do have the name of the choir that's in. You can't always get what you want.
I think her name's like Mary something.
Madeline Bell?
Yes, that sounds correct.
Yeah, she is an essential part of that song.
Mary Clayton. I'm sorry, Mary Clayton did
that's it.
background vocals of "Give Me Shelter." Yeah.
She is such an incredible part of that song for me. I love her when her voice cracks on the song from singing so strongly. I love the ratchet sound that kind of serves as the backbone of that song. It's just an unbelievable opening track, and it just highlights the things to come on this album.
You know the interesting thing about that, though, what Gimme Shelter's about, right? Everybody just always assumes it's about like turmoil in the world, but it's very much not.
What is it about?
At least according to Keith Richards.
Oh, okay.
Mick Jagger says lyrically the song is about the Vietnam War.
Yep.
Keith Richards says it's about the tension he felt between him and Mick Jagger when Mick Jagger went to film a movie with Richards' girlfriend Anita Pallenberg,
and
then he did it. And so all the music behind is supposed to be Keith Richards autobiographically talking about that affair, whereas Mick Jagger heard it and wrote lyrics about the Vietnam War, which I think makes that song even more fascinating.
Okay, interesting. Two different places then. I love Love in Veins, which is the second song. I think it's a Robert Johnson homage or cover.
It's a mock-up. It's kind of like parts of it are similar to Robert Johnson songs, but it's not a direct cover.
Okay. I love the slow, like, bluesiness of it. I love the mandolin. I think Ry Cooder plays the mandolin on that. And I forgot that Country Honk is just Honky Tonk Woman, but, like, slowed down acoustic version of the song. I love Honky Tonk Woman, so that was interesting to hear. You have the sick bass line and Live With Me to start out that song. That was great. The piano is great in Let It Bleed. And how can you not like Midnight Rambler, a song about the Boston Strangler, which I love the tempo in that on that drums and how it speeds up and slows down. And then the surprise song for me is Monkey Man, which I can't believe I must have heard it at one point, but listening to it again this time, it was just a great song to hear, and I loved it. Sounded so different than anything else on the album, and I can't put my finger on what it is about that song that I like so much, but it's a really good, strong song. And then, I mean, ending the record with You Can't Always Get What You Want, which is probably more played than Gimme Shelter, but the chorus on that, and I mean, it's just a top to bottom. It's a fantastic album, and you can see why the Stones are so great listening to it. So big recommend for me.
Yeah, I think Monkey Man, you probably heard that was another good. I always think of Goodfellas when I hear that song, because that was used multiple times as well as Give Me Shelter. But yeah, this is a fantastic record. It's one of the few Stones albums that I knew pretty well going into the podcast here, because I've owned it for many years. Yeah, I can't say enough good things about Give Me Shelter. That might be my favorite Stone song of all time. It's eerie. I love the guitar part, the guitar plucking at the very beginning. Mm-hmm. And listening to it this time around on headphones, I heard that more, because normally your attention goes right there at the very beginning, and then when they start the ooze, the kind of the chorus comes in and the piano, like that took over for me. But I stood with the guitar part and while it was going, and it's just in this background, it does some other things that I was surprised by that I never really picked on before, and made me like it even more. It's just this eerie, really cool song. I don't think I really knew it till I was in college. Somebody was playing it, my neighbor in my dorm was playing it. And I was like, I did remember, I think I certainly must have heard it at some point, but something about it, I like woke up from a nap or something, and that was playing next door, and I was like, what the hell is going on over there? Like, what is, but that's a fantastic song. I love the country elements in here, like you mentioned, the mandolin, like in Love in Vain, and Country Honk's great with the fiddle. You got the Silvers are great, kind of country-esque song. They do that Americana, roots rock, country type sound very, very well, and it stands out here, at least with three of the tracks 3 of the 9 tracks on here. So I really appreciated that. Monkey Man's got a great riff. That's what does it for me. It's just a great guitar riff. And the piano in the background adds to it as well. Let It Bleed might be my second favorite song on this. I've always loved the structure of that song, the chorus. Just it hits me right away, and I love it. I like Midnight Rambler. That might be my least favorite song on the record, actually. And I don't know if it's just the overuse of the harmonica or part of it might be the production of it, or the way that it's the echoey part, or just the guitar part. It's good, and I got to point it out that it's my least favorite on here, because I love everything else, and I like that song. You
disagree with Keith Richards because it's his favorite Rolling Stones song ever.
And that makes sense, like it totally. And when I was listening to it, I was like, am I sure that this is my least favorite? And I was like listening to it, and I'm going, well, it's still really good, and I think if they were playing it live, like, I think I'd be totally into it. You know what I mean? But it's just something about when it's on the record. The other songs I'm much more moved by than that one. But it doesn't surprise me that Richards would love that song, and and other real. That's probably the bluesiest song on here. So like for hardcore blues people, which the Stones clearly were. That totally makes sense. Big fan of this album. It's not my favorite Stones record. We're gonna cover that later, but this is it's an excellent record. It's not terribly long. It's like 40 minutes, so it's a really good length, and a variety. I do like the variety here. You're getting a little bit of different types of genres and sounds, and just it's all the stuff that the Stones do really, really well. So very strong record here for me.
Yeah, this is just such a riffy album. Like, the guitar parts on this album are fantastic. The bass line, this is Bill Wyman's best Stones album, and also Bill Wyman, along with the bass lines, he also that vibraphone, that he plays in Monkey Man, is also really interesting as a choice. But I think what I think of with this album is some of my favorite deep cuts from the Stones are on this album, like. You got the Silver and Monkey Man and Midnight Rambler, and they all come at like Midnight Rambler. You got the Silver, Monkey Man are in a row, 6, 7, 8. The guitar is excellent here. This is a dark lyrical album. It's perfect for the time. Like, I almost feel like you could put this album in and get a feel for what like late 1969 felt like. And there's a lot of cliches of people saying that about music, that sometimes it's like, it's overwrought a little bit. This one can hold up to that. Especially starting with Gimme Shelter, which they talked about. We haven't really talked about You Can't Always Get What You Want, which is an awesome song on a lot of layers. I know that John Lennon, never one to love to give credit to anyone else, including his own bandmates, often said that, the Stones were aping what the Beatles were doing. And they were very guilty of that at times. Like, Your Satanic Majesties is the most telling example of that. But if you go off of the idea that You Can't Always Get What You Want is basically the Stones trying to write Hey Jude, which Mick Jagger pretty much admitted, like, the Stones wrote Hey Jude better than the Beatles did here, because You Can't Always Get What You Want is an awesome song on a number of fronts. It is the only song that can end this album as well, of the tracks on here as well, which is something we talked about. You want to talk about perfect placement. That's there. I love the placement of Let It Bleed and Midnight Rambler on here, because it almost threatens to get not as bleak after Country Honk and Live With Me. Country Honk's like a uneasy song, because it's a slowed down, off-kilter version, as Josh said, of Honky Tonk Woman, which is a much more joyous song. But then, boy, does it get dark with Let It Bleed and Midnight Rambler again. It's like, yep, back on theme right here. It's some of the best lyrics that Mick Jagger ever wrote. They're, as Josh said, they're super duper tight, which would be something that continues on Sticky Fingers before, Exile's its own beast, which we'll talk about down the road. But yeah, I mean, this is a really good place to start if you know sort of the hits of the Stones that would have been in the mid-'60s, the early and mid-'60s, but you want to kind of know what made the Stones, because even more so than Aftermath and Beggar's Banquet, this is when that darkness of the Stones comes in, when they're still young and kind of like the most alive band you can be, playing music designed to be played live, but they haven't become the Stones that by the mid 70s they'd become, where they were sort of, as much celebrities as they were musicians, and lost a lot of their dangerousness and just became famous. It's like, that's the hardest thing for the Stones. It's like the Stones were super dangerous till they weren't anymore. And, you can only be like that for so long. but they, more than most, I think, it like transitioned from, sort of like an alternative to the bands around them into like the big band that I think people think of as the Stones now, like still touring in their 70s, soon to be 80s, right? So that's kind of what my take is. I actually left out a quote I definitely wanted to share because I thought it was like the perfect Mick Jagger quote, and I'm trying to pull it up because it made me laugh reading it, and I just thought you guys would find it funny too. But unfortunately, I don't have it on me, and I'm probably going to look it up as you guys finish up. Just because it made me laugh. It was at a press conference. Oh, here we go. I actually got it. I'm sorry. At the in Gimme Shelter, it's actually in the movie, but it's also from a press conference. Somebody asked Jagger if he's finally any more satisfied now, based off of Satisfaction, and he says, financially dissatisfied, sexually satisfied, and philosophically trying, which I thought is like the best way to describe the Stones of this era. Period. And there you go. If you want like a one sentence review of the Stones during the late 60s and early 70s, there you go. That's what I think probably the Stones are.
Financially dissatisfied?
Hence why they became, like the juggernaut they were later, right? Sexually satisfied, which they continued, and philosophically trying. There you go.
Man.
That's the Stones to me.
Yeah.
And that's what makes them the Stones. So
it's hard to, you think of the Stones as this gigantic band, and this places them in their prime. So if you haven't ever listened to them, to see what makes them special and kind of take them in that prime context, this is like one of the best albums to do that with.
Well, and they're a huge band before this, and they're a huge band after this, but this is where they're both a huge band and like hitting on all cylinders in terms of writing music to be played live. And that to me is what always stands out to them compared to many of their British contemporaries. Because you got to remember, the Kinks hate touring. The Beatles don't tour, for 4 years at the end of their career. Yeah. It's really, you've got the Who and you've got the Stones of the big band. But, by this point, the Who and the Stones are going in totally different directions, right? And so to me, what makes the Stones is they're quintessentially a live band. And that's what, to me, the best Stones albums are, is you hear them and then you want to hear them live.
Were the Who not quintessentially a live band?
They were. That's what I was saying. It's them, the two of them.
Oh, you said they were going in different directions, though.
But musically, yeah. I mean, when you're making Tommy and you're making Let It Bleed, you're in different places. Who's Next and Sticky Fingers are going in different directions, so that's kind of what I was getting at. But both of them are quintessentially live bands.
Yeah, yeah.
In a way that, the Kinks always hated touring and then couldn't do it and stuff, and the Beatles just tapped out.
Gave it up.
After a while. Yeah. So that's, what you're looking at here. And, Zeppelin comes later, but they're their own entity. It's really the Stones and the Who are the quintessential touring British rock bands right now, and probably rock bands in general.
Yeah, and I just love how, everything comes together here. It's you have elements of kind of the earlier stuff, but the darker elements. They're doing some experimentation. It's not crazy, going off kilter, or going over the top or anything like that. And they're just writing great songs. The musicianship is great, and they're hitting their roots. They're trying a little country. They're trying, longer songs, and it just all fits so well together. So I always like this record.
Another thing I'd say about the Stones is like they're at their best when they write songs where they're just not good people. It's just you know what I'm saying? Like, the Beatles, they have a lot of songs that are, Here Comes the Sun and stuff, and love song. I mean, when the Stones write the Stones write about love, like they try, they'll write like Angie, right, and stuff like. But let's be honest, when the Stones write their best love songs, it's like a love that's messy and complicated and in this era difficult, as seen on most of the Aftermath album, right? And this is like that too. They just
it was more raw. It was dirtier. It was like more. As you say, like in the 70s, like
in relationships.
Seedier,
Yeah. Well, it's all the stuff that's in relationships, but some people, it doesn't happen very often, and probably not in healthy relationships either. You know what I mean?
No,
But
right,
that's
yeah.
what the Stones are. They're just like, they're all your basest instincts, you know? And that's, I think, what this album is. It's base instincts.
And in some ways, that's more real, right? Like it's, if you're talking about everything's like, candy canes and butterflies or whatever, it's not always like that. Sometimes it's darker.
It's not really what you aspire to and what you'd recommend to do,
right.
but it goes back to that idea, like, do you want to hear music that's about who you are, or do you want to hear music about people that are more interesting than you? And that, and that's why they say there's no stars in music right now. And like, do you want to write a song? Like a good example, we talked about Prince, right? Like, do you want to hear music about people who have sex like you do, or people that have sex like Prince does? It's like, and that's kind of like how it's a joke, you know what I mean?
John, how does Prince how do you know how Prince has sex?
Listen to Dirty Mind and you'll get quite a bit of, but I guess that's an extreme example, but you get what I'm saying. It's like what you aspire to out of your music historically is like a grandiose vision of it, right? And I think one of the things that's really interesting about modern music is the idea of being relatable has become more and more of what we're looking for in music, to the point where now you almost can't be like and we can go this another road, but like, well, and that there's good about that, right? Because there's a lot of things that were problematic about it, but also there isn't anybody that you look. I'm sorry, I'm rambling a little bit. It's kind of like the idea of Tom Cruise as a film star, right? Like, there aren't many Tom Cruises anymore because now everybody tries to be relatable as an actor, right? But what makes Tom Cruise is he's kind of batshit insane and makes big movies, and you just don't run into Tom Cruises, like people that'll just do their stunts and be kind of insane, right? And that's what rock kind of was, and music in general was. And now the relatability factor, I totally get it, but then the question is, did we lose something when people were trying to write the songs about your relationship instead of, Love in Vain, or,
Well, you still have someone like Kanye, right? Like, he's not
well,
relatable.
and he's, I mean, hip-hop is kind of that last bastion,
Yeah.
You hear people say that all the time, but it really is when you think about it. Like stars with a capital S.
Yeah.
Complicated,
Yeah, and they're projecting a lifestyle for sure, a lot of those artists.
Yeah, like I said, I'm not advocating that it has to be that way, but it's just the Stones, I think, can probably seem anachronistic, especially to younger people. It's like, well, what's the big deal? But it's like, dude, the Stones are rock to some degree.
Yeah.
And I think I started thinking about this because Josh and I did do that Elvis thing, and it's like we listened to Elvis. It's like, well, shit, Elvis is Elvis. You forget it until you listen to it. It's like, well, Elvis is. There aren't people that do Elvis. Like, and you have to be reminded of that sometimes. So. Yeah, so, and the Beatles are the Beatles, so we're getting into those groups that it's like, well, here you go. These are the people that are like, we're going to get Hendrix, right? Next week, it's like Hendrix on the guitar on Are You Experienced? There ain't a lot of people who play like that,
Yeah.
So, and have that mega charisma, So.
Yeah, I mean, they were like the Rolling Stones are kind of like the prototypical rockers.
Touring
or
rock
what
band,
you think
yes.
of. Yeah, so they're living that lifestyle.
Arena rock, yeah.
Yep.
Quick cleaning of the stacks. Actually, Josh, you were right. Love in Vain was written by Robert Johnson.
It was, okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Everything
Gotcha.
else was written by Jagger and Richards.
Gotcha.
All right.
Okay, I apologize. I'm glad you cleaned it.
Yep.
So high recommend from all of us on that album for sure.
Yeah, it'll be right on the border of my top 10 for the 60s. It's going to be right on that edge of like 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, somewhere around there.
I always liked the cover of this record, too. My mom had it as a kid, and I was like,
birthday
cake? I was like, cake, and a bicycle tire. It doesn't fit, but it's still cool.
And then isn't the flip side or the inset like the cake smashed or something?
Yeah, I think,
Yes, it is.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yeah. Nice.